Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Brian Kemple to discuss medieval semiotics and the gradual development and reflection on the being and activity of science in the Middle Ages, beginning with Augustine of Hippo and culminating with John Poinsot in the early modern period. And then another interesting distinction that Scotus bequeaths to the later medieval period is his idea of intuitive versus abstractive intellection. This becomes very influential on later figures, and I think it's even taken up by Poinsot. I think is it book 3 that he investigates this distinction in his Tractatus. What exactly is this distinction that Scotus makes?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an unfortunate terminology in my opinion.
Sure.
And I think the word intuition and intuitive has just become so
it's a dirty word. Yeah.
And abstractive, I think this is actually a better sense of the term abstractive than what's normally applied to the operation of abstraction.
Right.
But that's another discussion altogether in its own right. Essentially, the difference between the two is that intuitive cognition pertains to something which is present of itself, whereas the abstractive is in its absence. So there's a way in which there's even, I think, a great anticipation of some of the themes that emerge in, like Husserlian phenomenology in the discussion of presence and absence through intuition and abstraction.
Okay.
And I actually think a lot of what Poinsot has to say is, to my mind, better than what Husserl has to say on the matter. But yeah, it's there's a lot of fascinating things that come out with respect to it as well, especially in terms of the cohesion of our intellection and sensation, and the one of the things that Poinsot elaborates on this, and I'm much more familiar with Poinsot's writing on this than I am with Scotus's. One of the things that Poinsot elaborates on is the notion of something like experimental certitude, way ahead of his time, right? That there has to be a kind of intuitive cognition, right? So even if the formal object which you're considering is not something fully instantiated in the sensible in some way, we want that experiential, sensible, intuitive presence of the object somehow, right? Even if it's only as an effect and not as the thing in itself. So you think about, I don't know, something like a proof of God's existence. Right?
Sure.
Okay, well, we can't have an intuitive presence of God himself as we are here and now, because, well, if we did, none of us would ever, sin or anything like that.
Sure.
We'd have the full goodness fully present to us. But when we understand God as cause and creator of the universe, well, we can understand the effect intuitively. And say, okay, well, understanding what existence is and how it must be derived, from a supreme creator, just seeing that things are in some way becomes an intuitive presence, an intuitive cognition of God's creative efficacy. So you bringing any intellection back to sensation, even if you're just understanding it as an effect, is an account of intuitive presence. Whereas if you have something which can't be physically present to you at the moment, you can only have an abstractive cognition. So, if I close my blinds and I can't see the tree anymore, we're going back to the tree. Well, it's abstractively present to me now.
Right.
And as it's only abstractively present to you because you can't see it in any way whatsoever.
Right. I'm relying on your testimony.
Yeah, you can picture it, you can imagine what it is. I could tell you, I could give you a little more specificity and say it's a maple tree, And so if you know the shape of a maple tree's leaves or its typical branch distribution or the shape of its bark, you can maybe picture it a little bit more accurately,
Mm.
but still only abstractively and not intuitively.
Very
Yeah, and so you can
interesting.
see the immense importance of signs for that, right?
Right, I was going to say, yeah.
I mean, abstractively present things can only be present to us through some. Uh, Peirce uses, or Poinsot uses the word vicegerent a lot, which is something bearing or taking up the duty of another, kind of like vice regent, right? Which I actually transposed the letters in my mind for a long time, kept reading it as vice regent. But the vicegerent, a bearer on the part of the significant, that it has to be present somehow in the signed vehicle, as the signed vehicle takes up the office or the duty to signify on behalf of the significant. So your abstractive presence of the maple tree in my front yard is based on whatever image, phantasm you form for yourself of what a maple tree is or what it could be.
Mm. But it's able to signify, if such a maple tree exists, the maple tree that is present to you.
Yeah, and you can only verify that through some sort of intuitive cognition. You have to be able to
Right.
come back to the thing itself in some way.
Right. That makes sense. I figured maybe we could switch to discussing two other figures, or I wish we could discuss more, but once we get to later figures that where we start to reach what we would call in periodization like early modernity, um, there's a lot. This question of signs and their being is taken up again by Iberian figures, by like Jesuit thinkers, by a group of thinkers known as the Conimbricenses. Um, where would you want to start with all that? Would you want to discuss Fonseca first, Pedro da Fonseca, or discuss the Conimbricenses? How would you want to tackle like early modernity?
Yeah, I mean it's it's so hard, right? Because there's so
Mm,
many names. So I mean the real key figure in I think the greatest contributions and especially it is the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal and Spain where a lot of this unfolds. Um, and Portugal was influential on quite a large swath of the world at this point in time. But yeah, Pedro de Fonseca is probably the key figure. It's hard to mention him though without mentioning because one of his key contributions is the distinction into instrumental and formal signs, but he's
mm,
not the figure who originates that. That goes back as far as Pierre de Dailly. I'm not really sure how to pronounce his name.
yeah.
French figure, who's 1350 to 1420, who raises this distinction but doesn't systematically institute it in any
Mm,
way.
mm,
That's done systematically by Domingo de Soto in the early 16th century, about I want to say 1494. I think he was born. Died in 1560 something. So overlapping with Pedro da Fonseca's life from 1528 to 1599. Um, but what Fonseca really does, where he's really most important, I mean, he emphasizes this notion of instrumental and formal, and causes controversy in the way that he does so.
mm,
What Fonseca um, really does, I think, his real influence, his real importance is he's really the one who establishes the Conimbricenses. He's not an author in their works directly. They may have taken from some of his writing and incorporated it and edited it and what have you. But he really gathered together, in a sense, these key figures, these Jesuits at the University of Coimbra. Um, a handful of known figures, an unknown double handful of others, right? So you've got Emmanuel de Goes, Cosmas de Miguelas, Balthazar Alvarez, Sebastian de Coto. These are the real key figures, especially the last, de Coto, who's probably the key author of the Conimbricenses Treatise on Science. He's certainly the editor of the edition that was published. in 1606, 1607, and probably, I believe, Helene Leblanc has a good presentation on his probable authorship of the treatise on science. So Fonseca is really the one who administratively leads this effort in some sense. He says, we really need a kind of cursus philosophicus. We need a discussion of what are the essential things that people need to study in philosophy so that they can carry on good philosophical debates and apply this in theological controversy as well. So his own written work that helps to launch this is the Institutionum Dialectarum Liberi Acto, institutions of dialectic in 8 books, commentating on and elaborating on Aristotle and on some of these sort of controversies which had arisen in logic. And his own discussion of signs in there is actually relatively brief, and especially where he discusses the instrumental and the formal sign. It's a very, it's a short couple of pages. It's fairly dense and it's very Jesuitical.
Sure. Well, if I can circle back to that then about his distinction between formal and instrumental signs, I know I think we briefly touched on this maybe in Bacon about how there's already kind of an understanding that what Augustine's talking about in his definition is instrumental signs. But what is this distinction? What does he mean by formal and instrumental signs, Pedro da Fonseca?
Yeah, so the formal sign, and this is sort of where the language begins to make the proper distinctions, right? I mean, this is in the wake of Aristotle. To understand what something is formally is to understand its proper own being, right? So when we get this, Baconian sort of notion that, well, wait a second, there's all sorts of things which are signifying that are not presented to the senses, that don't need to be grasped as objects themselves. Right? This is what a sign most formally, fundamentally, essentially is itself, right? Is this making known or representing something other than itself. So this then comes to be contrasted with the instrumental sign, which is that which has to be grasped as an object itself in order that you can then proceed on to the significant.
I see.
So the stop sign, we'll use our classic example here. You have to be able to see and perceive and grasp sensibly the shape, the color, the lettering, right? To then move further on to the law, which is the object signified that your car must come to a complete full stop approximately where the sign is.
Right.
So that the thing itself, right, the vehicle, serves as an instrument in a sense for the conveyance of the object. It has to be used itself through what it itself is somehow in order that you grasp this other. Same thing with natural signs. The instrumental cuts across the divide of natural and conventional. Smoke, right? You have to see the smoke to know that it signifies fire.
Right.
And what becomes really interesting in a lot of this discussion further on is that you can see that instrumental signs are always reliant upon formal signs, right? Unless you have some conceptual cognitive grasp or perceptual grasp of what the relation is, the instrumental sign doesn't actually signify. Go back again, the stop sign, you drop it in North Sentinel Island, right? They're not going to know.
Right, exactly.
They'll have the instrument, but they won't have the signification because they don't have the formal sign by which to interpret that instrument.
Right, exactly. I mean, at the very least, we could say that the stop sign on the island, it might be like a potential sign. Maybe if the inhabitants were brought in dialogue with the rest of the world, they might understand, okay, it signifies to stop at a certain location at a certain point in time. But until that discourse happens, at best, it's only like a potential conventional sign. or an instrumental sign for the inhabitants.
Right, right. And yeah, what you um, and just to go back to Fonseca, because we probably don't want to drag this out too long.
Sure, sure.
From in Fonseca, it's interesting because he notes what a formal sign is and what it ought to be, but he pivots back into this Augustinian conception and saying that, well, we're actually kind of equivocating and calling these two things signs.
Right.
That really the instrumental is the sign. The form signs don't really represent the other; they represent our idea of them. And in this way, he's actually, without really intending it at all, laying the ground for modernity. I mean,
Right.
I don't know if there's any actual genealogy in this sense, but being a member of the Jesuit order, he possibly influenced Suarez,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote his Disputationes Metaphysicae in 1597, or published them in 1597, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
And Suarez influenced Descartes.
Right.
Um, not directly. Descartes probably read a sort of distillation of the Suarezian philosophy at La Flèche. There's a good chance that Fonseca, Suarez, Descartes, modernity,
Right.
he, at least maybe not directly, but he was poking in this direction. So
Right. It definitely is interesting to see the similarities between their accounts of signs and cognition between early modern figures and Fonseca. We should let we should let radical orthodoxy figures know that there's a new game changer in town. Forget Scotus, it's Fonseca that gave us death camps.
bit of a leap, but sure.
Sure, yeah. All right, so I figured we might end the two-part series of the interview by discussing this last figure, very influential on John Deely's writings and thought. John of St. Thomas, or John Poinsot, is as he's often called. Uh, who is this figure, John Poinsot? When exactly, approximately, did he live? Was he contemporaneous with anyone of note? What can you say to that?
Yeah. He was born in 1589 and died in 1644. He lived an oddly cosmopolitan life in some way. I mean, his father was essentially an ambassador, so he came from a kind of noble family, very strangely sort of mixed parentage, Burgundian and Iberian, Portuguese, educated partially in Coimbra. He studied with the Conimbricenses, and that's where he received his initial formation. And then he went to Belgium to complete his studies, where he entered the Dominican order in 1614. And that's when he chose the religious name John of St. Thomas, because of his deep influence by the thought of St. Thomas and dedication to his thought. In fact, at the time of his death, he wrote that he thought nothing that he ever wrote in any way contravened the teaching of St. Thomas. That was his whole dedication. And in fact, he has a wonderful little treatise in his Cursus Theologicus on an approbation on the wisdom and authority of St. Thomas's teaching, which I'm hoping to get translated and published sometime in the near future.
The Thomas Handbook.
Little side project, as though I need yet another one. But yeah, he was. As I mentioned, studied under the Conimbricenses, but became a Dominican, and spent most of his teaching career at the University of Alcala, which is, I believe, essentially now a suburb of Madrid. So he was also he ended his life. Well, let me speak quickly to that. University of Alcala. He was appointed first to. They had two chairs of theology there. I love this little structure that they had. They had a minor chair and a major chair. The minor chair was the evening star, and the major chair was the morning star.
Oh, I love that.
And so he held both successively, but not long after he was appointed to being the Morning Star chair of theology, he was requested by the King of Spain to come be his personal confessor. So he went and told the king that he would be his confessor if he was willing to hear the truth in all matters, and not looking just for a sort of yes man, but someone who's going to actually hold him to task. But unfortunately, as the king's confessor, he was with the king when a siege was conducted, and as many people did during sieges, contracted an illness and died.
I see.
So fairly short life, but accomplished quite a bit and wrote quite a lot. His two major works are a Cursus Philosophicus in 3 volumes, about 2,800 pages of brilliant philosophy, and then a Cursus Theologicus in about 8,000 pages. Nothing compared to, say, the output of a Francisco Suarez or even a Thomas Aquinas, but an awful lot of output for a fairly short life, and one in which he had quite a lot of teaching duties as well. So, but what he's really come to be known for in recent years is particularly by the work of John Deely, who was in his own graduate school experience enamored of the Cursus Philosophicus. What Deely saw in that work was a collection of questions that really do bear heavily upon our understanding of signs. And so Deely took these texts and sort of arranged them in a kind of novel way, and not without justification. There's a little bit of editorial extraction, right, and recomposition. But he arranged them and translated them in a work which is available under the title Tractatus de Signis, the treatise on signs. And there we find, much like I think Aquinas himself, it's not that there are ex nihilo brilliant insights, formed fully, Minerva leaping out of the head of Zeus here, but a drawing together the insights in previous generations and previous thinkers to do something which is genuinely new as a whole, even if none of the parts are entirely new themselves.
Right. Well, to that end, I figured we might just hit the biggest question. What does John Poinsot think the sign relation consists in? What is the activity of the sign for Poinsot?
Yeah, so I think it's just helpful to just give a little bit of contrast to emphasize this with the Conimbricenses, which again were his own immediate teachers in his initial formation, and whose own work on the signs is also available in translation by John Doyle, the Conimbricenses, Some Questions on Signs. But the Conimbricenses define the sign, or give the formal character of the sign, as a proportionate fundament in the sign vehicle which affects the potency to the relation of knowing that which it signifies. So for the Conimbricenses, the sign is this relative characteristic in the sign vehicle. It's a relativum secundum dici. So the capacity that's in the sign vehicle for representing the significant is what they understand to be the formal character of a sign.
Interesting.
By contrast, what Poinsot says is that the rationale of a sign, formally speaking, does not consist in a relation according to the way being must be expressed in discourse, that is John Deely's translation of relativum secundum dici, but rather in a relation according to the way relation has being, the relativum secundum esse.
Ontological relation, right?
That ontological relation, that relation itself. So the sign is not any one of the 3 elements. It's not the vehicle, it's not the object, it's not the interpretant, or interpreter, or cognitive power, nor does it consist just essentially in the relation between the vehicle and the interpreter, nor just essentially in the relation between the vehicle and the object, but in the relation itself as irreducibly triadic, is necessarily incorporating all three elements. But the Conimbricenses have identified that formal, that fundamental proportion, right, in the vehicle is what Poinsot identifies as the material and presuppositive rationale of the representative quality. Right? So you need that material presuppositive, proportion, right? That there has to be this relation secundum dici in the vehicle somehow to the significant, that proportionality. But that's only the material aspect of it. The formal aspect is the relation itself.
Right. So maybe if you can give an example to help us understand this triadic relation. Take the example that we've been alluding to, the stop sign. So the stop sign, I guess, in and of itself, as like a material like entity or whatever, that's not a sign, strictly speaking.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is where it's so complicated with conventional signs, really,
sure,
because it's a secundum dici relativity, whereby it is proportionally related to the object signified, is purely from mind-dependent imposition.
Right.
There's a stipulation that was instituted. I don't know when stop signs were invented. That's a good question. Given how frequently I use
maybe
them as an example,
maybe artifacts weren't the right
example.
Well,
I think it's helpful because it can get us into it a little bit to think that, okay, well, this, we can recognize that there's a kind of stipulation there. We'll talk a little bit about stipulation versus custom momentarily, I think. But that stipulation then becomes a custom, right? You don't have to know who stipulated it. You don't have to know whose will imposed it. But living in a culture where stop signs are common, and really they are pretty much, I think, the entire world around, aside from places like North Sentinel Island. I think just about every country that has cars has stop signs. Maybe different colors, but still. We can see that proportionate relation by the customs of society,
right?
That it exists within that. Whereas you could take something else like smoke and fire. You can even tell that there's a kind of proportionality in degree. The more smoke, the more dense it is, the more quickly it is billowing upwards, the more intense the fire.
Right.
So once you know that proportion, once you know the secundum dici relativity in the smoke, you know its signification of the fire. Right? You grasp materially that formal relation.
I see. Well, what exactly does this understanding of the sign, how does this come to bear on Fonseca's distinction between formal and instrumental signs? I mean, does this an irreducibly triadic relation, does this obtain equally for instrumental signs as it does for formal signs, or is there something of a disunity? Well, what can you say to that?
Yeah, well, again, this is where you have to have the formal sign in order that any instrumental sign actually signify.
Sure.
The proportion in the vehicle, in the material instrumental something which operates as an intermediary between the interpreter and the object, has to also be proportioned to some conceptual or perceptual sign in the mind of the cognizer. So you actually end up with two triadic relations whenever you have an instrumental sign present.
I see.
Because there's the instrumental sign presenting to the sense powers the object signified, but then there's also in the mind of the cognizer some, if you're in any way relating to the object formally, there has to be some sense, perception, phantasm, concept, something in the mind, which is then a vehicle there, making known the formal object to the mind itself.
I see.
Now, there are some interesting points about the intuitive cognition and interpretation of sense without any sort of deliberative or discursive reasoning, but that's probably more complicated than we have time to get into here.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, as with many like questions of philosophy, I mean, sometimes it's difficult to use the platform of a podcast to communicate it, but I still think it's a good
Yeah,
practice.
we don't have 50 hours to talk about every topic,
Right.
unfortunately.
Right. Exactly. Well, and another interesting question. I mean, if I can ask this and push this, I mean, we've been talking about mind-dependent entities and mind-independent entities, and that distinction, that discussion that obtains between, where does the being of signs fall under in this division? Um, where exactly does Poinsot think that this irreducibly triadic relation is this relation a mind-dependent entity? Is a mind independent entity? We've already established that it's an ontological relation, but where exactly does it fall in this division?
Well, yeah, and this is, I mean, this is actually something that Aquinas really helps us to understand a lot as well, I think, because Aquinas makes the point several places throughout his corpus, but most especially actually in discussion of the Trinity, that relation alone among all of the things enumerated in the categories can have something of the ens naturae and the ens rationis of it, right?
Right.
That one in the same relation, and this is the point that Daly stresses, especially Poinsot makes this point, but Daly really stresses it like nobody else I've ever seen. That one in the same relation under one set of circumstances can be a mind-dependent relation, real relation, and under another set of circumstances can be a mind-dependent relation.
Right.
Daly's favorite example to use in class all the time was two lovers going to meet each
It
other
was so dark,
walking down the
right?
street.
Right.
Yeah, and a meteor comes out of nowhere and strikes the man, right? And now he's gone. And so the woman, unbeknownst to her, is going to meet an ens rationis, right?
Right.
Because he doesn't exist anymore, at least not in the same respect, or is the same particular kind of thing.
Mm.
So before the meteor hits, it's an ens reality. It's a real relation. They really related one to another, boyfriend, girlfriend. The meteor comes and strikes. Now she's relating to something which is just a pure object. But it's
Mm.
the same relation. It's still signified the same way in her mind. The sign vehicle in her mind is still signifying the same objects to her. And even once you know, right, that someone has died, which is always an interesting fact, right? That unless you happen to be there, and even then, oftentimes someone dies before you know that they're dead. Right? There's a time gap. Um, that time gap, right? The relation is independent of your knowledge. Right?
Mm.
So that person's death, when that person dies, that body ceases to be that person before you know it, instantaneously.
Right.
That relation has changed. No matter how far apart you are, no matter how long it takes for you to know, that relation changes immediately. You could be on the other side of the world. You could be, thousands of miles away. Have no idea, right?
Right.
And yet that relation has really changed from being a real relation to being a relation of reason.
Right.
Um, and then even once you know, right, you still hold that object in the same way. Um, you know, I can think my father passed away 15 years ago. I can think of my father and I still think of him, right? It's
Right.
still the same object, but the condition of thinghood isn't there anymore. That body is no longer my father's body. It's
Right.
no longer my
Right.
father. So yeah, I mean the questions of what kind of thing is the sign relation? Well, it's not really a thing. First of
Right. That's
all,
the
I
one
mean
first thing.
it's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's a relation. It's equiprimordial with things in some sense, right? That there's a quote
Benedict the
John Daly
16th.
loves. Yes,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
from his Introduction to Christianity, published in 1970, that The undivided sway of thinking in terms of substance is ended. Relation is revealed as an equally valid primordial mode of reality. And yeah, it's there, and you can't reduce it, right, to being a mind dependent or a mind independent thing.
Mm.
This relation is what it is, right? Because it is a relatio secundum esse.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it exists, whether the object at which it terminates is a real thing or not.
Right. And another example that Dealey sometimes likes to play with is the idea of like an archaeologist in a fossil of like a dinosaur or something, that the leg might relate to the rest of the dinosaur. I'm not familiar with dinosaurs, unfortunately, but like we could imagine a scenario, and the leg does, the bone that was once part of a leg really does relate to the rest of the dinosaur, but the dinosaur doesn't exist as a real entity. It just, we have like a mind dependent entity that we form with of the dinosaur.
Right. And that's where you see the enormous complexity of everything essentially human that opens up with this recognition of science and what science really are.
Mm.
Because if I go start digging in my backyard and I find a dinosaur bone, pretty unlikely, but you never know. First glance, I'm not going to have a damn clue what it is, right? I'll probably think, did I just hit a pipe or something? Right. So I'm going to see this instrumental thing. And because of my lack of the knowledge, because of my lacking the appropriate formal signs, I will construct another fictitious entity to which this part belongs as a whole.
Mm.
The paleontologist comes along and he looks at the bone and he goes, oh no, right away he can tell you, it's a bone. He could maybe even tell you broad strokes type of dinosaur. Is this a carnivore or a herbivore, or is it a small dinosaur, or a dinosaur of this era or this age, or a Mesozoic era or whatever? I don't
Mm.
really know much about dinosaurs either, but he'll be able to tell those things because he has the formal signs whereby he's able to construct a more accurate model of what the mind independent thing was, but it's still a model.
Right.
He doesn't have the intuitive presence of the thing itself as the thing itself actually was to verify this model's truth.
It's just
Right.
abstractive, right?
Yeah, it's been actually a controversy in recent years as to whether or not dinosaurs had feathers.
Right, exactly.
We've been picturing them as these scaly, lizard-like creatures for generations, but maybe they weren't. Maybe
Hmm.
maybe some of them, were part scaly and part feathery, like birds are today.
Well, that might help feed into another question that I was going to ask, whether or not Poinsot ever considers what failed signs or failed sign relations might be, or what exactly they consist in. Because I know this was a topic of interest that Umberto Eco was fascinated about. If I'm not mistaken, he defines sign as like anything that could be used to deceive. I think that was
Yeah.
his quirky definition.
Yeah, I mean, Ponzo certainly gets into falsity and deception. He doesn't get so much into the idea of signs as failing, but he does get into the notion that there might be incompleteness in the relation somehow, right? Or
Mm.
that because, especially because of the way in which we're actually really so very dependent in all of our learning on conventional signs,
Right.
that there can be all sorts of mistakes that enter into there.
Right, failing to communicate, or you might wake up one morning and your partner or something along those lines might have like a monotone voice speaking to you, and they're like, oh, they must be very angry with me. Or no, they just had like didn't get enough sleep and they're tired, and that's why they're talking to you that way. And you're just, would it be a case of misinterpreting what what that means, what sign relation obtains there? Or
Yeah. And again, I mean, this is just, it gets so enormously complex in any actual concrete experience. Because yeah, what are we signifying when we speak? Well, This is actually, I think, an enormously important part for understanding rhetoric as an art, that our communication is, again, we never exist in this abstract world of quote unquote objective truth. We can't ascend to that level of impersonal communication. We are ourselves part of the signification which is delivered in any given instance of communicating,
Right.
especially in speaking. It's a little bit more abstracted, if you will, in the written word, but even there, the person exists in a way. We talk about an author's style or an author's voice or something like that. That's the personhood of the author in written form. Well, speaking, we have intonation. We have, yes, I could speak very monotone. I could start talking like this, and you might get that I'm a little bit maybe irritated at what you're saying to me, Hunter. Or, I can be as I am, which is actually, I think, much more casual. Telling you that I'm not irritated.
Right.
So there's not only signified the intellectual conceptual content by the given use of a voice, the given use of any instrumental material verbal sign vehicle, but there's also the cathectic modulation of the person as well, right? Those emotional modalities of how we are signifying things. And Poinsot treats of this in at least oblique ways when he talks about the excitation which is required that a sign actually signify, or that words actually signify. If I'm going to signify something to you, in order actually that it signifies to you, that doesn't mean that you just receive the material impression, but you get that intentional immutation as well, which to arouse, there has to be some excitation which is accomplished. If I'm just really, if I just sat here and said everything that I've said today in a purely monotone voice with no variation in my tone or anything, I'm sure most people would have clicked off this interview an hour ago,
right?
because they're not being aroused to thinking about the objects.
Right.
There has to be this motivation which is provided as well, and so that just adds all these various layers. And so to even go to something like Umberto Eco's point, I could use my intonation to deceive, right? I could start talking to you about bananas, right? And talking about the great wonder of bananas and how, amazing it is when you eat bananas, you're filled with potassium and your feet don't cramp up. And okay, I mean, I think it's good to have a sufficient amount of potassium, but I just don't think it's that exciting, right?
You made an excellent salesman, right?
Yeah, I mean, I could be, I don't know, any number of these internet pundits, right? Whose whole shtick really is the exaggeration through intonation. It's a deception, right? I mean, they're making much more important, or making sound much more important than they really are, what they're saying by this other dimension. It's not that the words they're saying signify objects in an untrue manner, or with an untrue intelligibility, I should say, but they do so in a deceitful manner. So we're being lied to all the time, in other words. So
that's a depressing thought.
Well, I mean, that's in a nutshell what Eco was. I mean, all of his fiction is really about deception.
Right. Yeah, Name of the Rose, that's the whole point, is that he thinks that there's like this grandiose like mastermind, like, who's trying to signify like the apocalypse is upon you, and no, it's just a bunch of like random sets of accidents that you've been imposing on some significance. Right.
Yeah, that's all about self-deception. Foucault's pendulum is about group self-deception. Prague Cemetery is about an individual deceiving large groups. It's all about deception in Eco.
All right. Well, I figured maybe there's just two more points I wanted to cover in John Poinsot before we close the interview. One with respect to his distinction between representation and signification, and then the last point is what Poinsot thinks are the three conditions that are needed for semiosis to obtain. So with the first question, this is an interesting point that Jacques Maritain was very impressed with in his degrees of knowledge, that there's a distinction that ought to be made between representation and signification. What is this distinction? Why does Poinsot make it? What can you say to that?
Yeah. So, most broadly, I mean, this is a whole lecture in its own right. But most broadly, we can distinguish between them by saying that representation is a genus, of which signification is a species.
Okay.
That representation includes self-representation. Something being itself represents itself. It doesn't signify itself. It may be signified to us through all sorts of means, but there's a way in which, and this pertains just very quickly to the distinction of intuitive and abstractive cognition as well, that when something is intuitively present, it may be signified to you and, sensorially or something like that, but it's still representing itself, right? In and through those things which taken severally or separately would be understood strictly as signs. It's there, right? So, I mean, right now, your listeners are hearing this, but we're on camera. We can see one another, which is very helpful, I find, for having a conversation.
Right.
You aren't actually being represented to me. You're only being signified because you're present only on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
You're present as pixels, right? Which may be, authentically signifying of you, but are deficient in that, right? It's two-dimensional. It's flat. I can't, if I move over this way or move over this way, you don't move in my perception, right? Because you are on this flat two-dimensional screen. I can't see the real three-dimensional you.
Right.
And so that really, it signifies you, but it's deficient. And that's actually one of the necessary conditions of signification, which we can talk about here in just a moment.
Right.
So representation, it represents you, right? But it represents you, it's an other representation. What I'm seeing on the screen is a representation of something other than the screen itself.
Right.
And this enters into some really interesting points as well with part of, I think, the root of this distinction actually has to do with scripture. Because and again, there's lots of complicated little nuances in the terminology here, but there's a relation and a slight distinction between representation and manifestation. But the two are often sort of used synonymously, and it's said that God manifests things.
Right, theophanies. Right.
Yeah, that he even manifests or represents us in a way, right? Or all things of creation, but he certainly doesn't signify or have signified to him things of creation.
Right.
They're represented in the divine ideas, but God doesn't need signs of me.
Yes.
He doesn't have to learn through this relational manner, since he is in himself all things most eminently, most perfectly. Yeah. So this does kind of bring to the point the three conditions. Now, I think what you and I had talked briefly about this, and there might have been a slight terminological sort of issue, that the formal rationale of the sign consists in that triadic relation, and so there's a threefoldness there. That you have to have that which signifies that which is signified, and that to whom something is signified.
The cognitive power, the interpreter, right?
Yeah, and even to put it in sort of grammatical terms, right? You have I guess a kind of nominative, which is the sign vehicle, an accusative, which is the object, and a dative, which is the interpreter or the cognitive power. But there's also a very interesting passage where Poinsot discusses, beyond the essential rationale of the sign, three required conditions, which are first, that the sign must be better known to us than the signified. The second, that it has to be, he puts it as subsidiary to or more imperfect than the significant or the thing signified. And that it has to be dissimilar to the significant.
Hmm.
And so thinking about, the screen, right, as what is better known to me than you yourself, this is very contextual. And I think we can get very confused about this condition in particular, because there are certainly things that are maybe better known in our experience that are still signified to us somehow. So if I see a picture of my mother, right? Um, I don't see pictures of my mother that often, right? Partly because she never has any up on Facebook or anything, right? Which is
Right.
all well and fine because no one should have anything on Facebook. No, I mean, if I see a picture of my mother, that will actually, in and of itself, just in terms of my own experience, be less well known to me than my mother is. I've seen my
Hmm.
mother many a time. I have lots of in-person experience of her. I don't, if it's, especially if it's a new picture, one I've never seen before. But I live about 800 miles away from my mother. So if I
Right.
have a picture here and now in front of me, it's better known quoad nos, quoad to me
Hmm.
in the context, right? So in the same way, if I see someone I know well on a screen, right, that I've had a lot of in-person experience with on the screen, again, the same thing. The screen is here, that person is not, right?
Hmm.
So that leads to the second, right, that the sign is somehow subsidiary or less perfect. Right? Well, the screen representation, the photograph, clearly less perfect than the thing itself. Right?
Right.
Um, no matter how good our digital environments end up becoming, even if we get fully immersive virtual reality 3D environments where we're all sitting around the same digital table,
Hmm.
Matrix style or something like that, it's still less perfect
Right.
than the thing itself, which
That
is a
makes
really
sense.
interesting point to think about in context of virtual environments and how we're able to produce simulacra these days.
Right.
But there's another. I mean, that's a hobby horse discussion of mine.
No, I
And then
I
third,
have sorry, go ahead.
well, no, go ahead because I was going to move on.
I
So
was just making a comment about how like I hated during COVID just being school was done virtually and I was like, oh, I'm not learning anything. This is awful. But yeah, go ahead.
yeah, well, and part of that I think is just the dismay at the imperfection that's experienced when everything is mediated by these rather imperfect and profoundly deficient signs. And that kind of leads to the third point that there be some dissimilarity, which is a little bit of an odd point because so much of signification is by similitude.
Hmm.
I mean, our concepts, right? Our Aquinas will even call them similitudo, right? The similitude of the thing, which is thereby signified. But that dissimilarity comes from those previous two conditions, right? It's better known to us, but it's also deficient. It's
Right.
less than somehow, and from that less than, especially, you get this dissimilarity, which I find actually, it maybe dismays some people, but I find it's part of the great wonder of learning that there's always more. You can always have a better representation of the signified. You can
Right.
always gain more. You can always make your significations more similar too. There's always progress to be made in our understanding and our learning.
Well, Dr. Kemple, this has been a very insightful and profound discussion. This has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much. If I can maybe ask some closing uh, questions and comments, what relevance would you say does the study of medieval semiotics have for us today? I asked this question maybe in reference to both medieval studies as a discipline of history, but also with respect to philosophy today, because one of the difficulties that I think medievalists have, at least the ones that I've interacted with and encountered, is they have a really hard time characterizing what exactly the medieval philosophy is, or what makes it distinct from other epochs or periods of philosophy, if they're going to treat it at all, because a lot of times we'll treat the medievals as like a flyover country where nothing of interest happened, those silly distinctions, and then Descartes happened, and then philosophy was made anew. But one of the interesting points that John Deely made through in a work in Medieval Philosophy Redefined as the Latin Age, I've got it right here, is he thinks that if we are going to engage in this activity of periodization, it might be beneficial to understand scholasticism as a development regarding what the nature of science is. Like, this is a very unique period of philosophy, and that the medievals are interested in is what exactly signs are and how it relates to our cognition.
Yeah. I mean, I think I disagree slightly with John on that. He has a point, and he has a purpose, right?
Sure.
In characterizing this development of semiotics throughout the Latin age. First of all, I think treating the Latin age, treating the period commonly called medieval, which again I do,
Right.
that phrasing, right, actually really, is mistaken, because if there's an aberrational period in the history of philosophy, it's modernity. But I think treating, and for that reason, treating the Latin age as though oftentimes it is just a matter of historical archaeology or something like that, I think that's abjectly stupid. I think from Augustine and Boethius to Aquinas and Scotus and Poinsot and everyone in between, I mean, these were men eminently concerned with the truth. All these figures just named, and all the ones that we've discussed today, and not truth as something propounded in an ideology or a worldview or from some particular perspective, but really just with the discovery of truth. The truth, not a truth, not this truth, not, although they often wrote their works in context of, the truths of the Catholic faith, it wasn't as though Catholicism was, a framework into which everything had to be fit, but it was seen as what actually confirms and verifies these truths which are discovered along the way. And so I think if we want to know the truth, we do well to follow them. And in particular, in terms of where I think they were developing, if we look at, and John Deely characterizes modernity as the way of ideas, right? And we could characterize postmodernity as the way of signs. We could probably characterize antiquity as the way of substance. That even though they didn't all use the term substance, they were seeking what substance is, whether they're holding like the pre-Socratics that it's really fire or it's water or something like that, or with Plato they're holding that it's the ideas, or with Aristotle they're holding that it's the substantial forms of corporeal entities, and perhaps some spiritual ones as well. They're really concerned with substance. I'd say that the Latin age is concerned with being increasingly in its full amplitude. So what you discover, it really is that trajectory that is espoused by Cardinal Ratzinger of realizing the equiprimordiality of relation with substance. That certainly doesn't characterize the whole period of Latin age philosophy, but it does characterize the trajectory that it was on. And
Right.
really realizing the full amplitude of being, both metaphysically considered and I would say semiotically considered. Not that they, again, would put it necessarily in those terms themselves, but you can see that full gamut expressed in the works of Thomas Aquinas. That full range of being is there in his thinking, and it's developed particularly within his tradition, but also in the dialogues with others.
Right. All right. Well, maybe as a closing question, I can ask, what recommendations would you have for folks who'd want to learn more about medieval semiotics or semiotics in general, or John Poinsot, or I don't know. We've
Yeah.
covered a lot in these two episodes. So
We have covered a lot. I mean, just very, very broadly, I can, of course, recommend the work of John Daly. He's difficult to get into. He's a difficult author. He writes like a 17th century scholastic with all these very long Baroque sentences.
right.
But his Medieval Philosophy Redefined is a great place to go for understanding the Latin age. His latest edition of the Basics of Semiotics, in its 8th edition, is an excellent work.
It's a little
For
pricey
anyone
though.
particularly, it's a little pricey. For anyone particularly interested in John Poinsot, I would recommend the work of Nathaniel Lyons, titled Science in the Dust. Also quite pricey, unfortunately. I myself am working on a book, knock on wood, on an introduction to semiotics in this tradition. So hopefully sometime in the next year or so, that will be at least in the works, if not in production. And then, of course, there is the Lyceum Institute, which I'm a little biased, I guess, but I'd say it's probably the best place in the world to learn semiotics. So, yeah. And a bunch of other resources. Maybe I can give you some links to throw in your show notes or what have you. But
sure.
Yeah, lots of stuff.
And then speaking to Poinsot, if I'm not mistaken, the Lyceum Institute has recently put out a major work of his, the Cursus Theologicus, and it's now in print. It's in Latin, but
yeah. It's all in Latin. It's the Vives edition. It's not critical. There is a critical edition in the works. They're only halfway done though, and they've been at it for 80 years.
Give or take 70 years, right?
Yeah, it's also about $500 just to get the unbound folios. So it's not cheap. So the whole Cursus Theologicus in the Vives edition has been published. You can find it on Amazon. It's 15 volumes, or it's 10 tomes, but I had to divide it up into 15 volumes to publish it. Get the whole thing for about $260. So it's a good deal. It's a steal. And if you can read Latin, you should buy it. Or even if you just aspire to read Latin, you might want to buy it.
Sweet. All right. Well, Dr. Kemple, thank you so much for this. This is amazing.
No, thank you. It was my pleasure. And maybe someday we'll have further discussions in this or another format about more and more of the signs of our times and lives.